Welcome to another episode of the Studio Archive podcast. My name is Ryan Armstrong. This is a podcast where we learn how to become better at producing and composing music. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Thanks so much for watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're at. I appreciate you. Looking forward to today's interview. But before we get into that, I want to let you know of a free resource I have for you. Especially if you're a beginner, you're just getting into music production, you're just kind of learning this stuff, then I've created this resource for you that's free. It's essentially a cheat sheet. I just make a bunch of my recommendations for plugins that you should buy and virtual instruments that you can get, even some gear, interfaces, mics, that kind of stuff. So check that out if you're just getting started. There's so much stuff out there, and so I wanted to consolidate it into my personal recommendations, and hopefully that will give you some direction on how to get started. So go check that out at thestudioarchive.co/cheat sheet, and you can grab that for free there. So awesome. Today's interview is with Philip G. Anderson. He is a multi-instrumentalist and composer from Georgia. And he's had a lot of success over the past few years with writing for TV and film and games and even dance. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and also how he's able to make a full-time income as a composer and so much more. So super grateful to Philip for coming on the show. Let's jump into that interview with Philip G. Anderson. All right, Philip, thanks so much for being on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in music?
Thanks again for having me. So my name is Philip G. Anderson. I'm a artist and composer, and I guess producer as well. I kind of do a little bit of everything in music nowadays. I do a lot of my own artistic work and release that through my name, and that's more of the contemporary classical sound. And then in addition to that, I do a lot of composing and scoring work, mostly through various production libraries and publishers for TV and film. So I'm kind of all over the place in the music world and writing all over the place as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. How did you get started in music in the first place? Have you been playing piano for a long time? Was that your first instrument?
So I've been involved with music basically my entire life. I took up drums first, actually, when I was just a real little kid. I don't know why my parents bought me a drum set. I'm sure that drove them insane. But I'd been drumming the entire time I was growing up. And then I went to college and studied music production and recording arts. And that's when I started to develop a focus in composition. Although I didn't do too much of that in school because that wasn't really the emphasis of the program. I took that more up after I graduated. And then after 2013, the year I graduated, I've just been working my way into the music industry with basically any opportunity that came my way. Piano, I didn't actually pick up until a few years ago. That is not anywhere close to my first instrument.
Wow,
I started
really?
playing drums first. Guitar I picked up while I was in school, although I'm not very good at guitar anymore because I haven't played enough. But piano is the newest instrument for me, but it's the one that I certainly spend the most time playing and performing. So at this point, it's probably the instrument I'm most proficient on.
Wow. I think that's impressive, listening to your music and knowing that it's only been a few years to... I had to take piano proficiency in school, and I know I got by, but I was like, man, this left hand, right hand thing is screwing me up. I've always been a guitar player. So.
Yeah. I wonder if
that's super
maybe
impressive.
Drumming helped me out.
Maybe,
up
yeah.
With, and with the feet as well, the different coordination. But I mean, I appreciate that you hear my music and think that it's good piano playing, but it certainly takes a lot of takes to get to that point. It takes a lot of recordings and a lot of practice. It's certainly not, I write a piece and then boom, it's recorded and good to go. It certainly is a long process for that.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. It's certainly, just listening back, I just assumed that you have been playing, most of your life.
Well, thank you.
Awesome.
I'm glad to hear that.
Who were some of your early inspirations, maybe that got you into this kind of a classical style or just even in general, who inspired you the most?
So I think growing up, I found myself listening to a lot of film music, which at the time I thought was kind of unusual because obviously you're a kid, you're growing up, all your friends are listening to pop rock groups or whatever's currently big at the time. So I was listening to a lot of early Hans Zimmer scores and Danny Elfman scores, and that kind of stuck with me through school. And then after I graduated, I don't know how I stumbled across them, but I started getting into Max Richter and Johann Johansson, even Philip Glass, and that musical style, something about it just drew me in. I connected with it. It spoke to me in a way that really any other musical style hasn't. And I found myself kind of writing my own music in that style, but still developing my own sounds and techniques through that. But that's kind of how I was introduced to this style of music, was through those artists and composers.
Okay. Were you writing before you started playing or learning piano a few years back? Were you writing and producing before that?
Yeah, although it was a lot of garbage that I was writing. I had been writing music again since I was a kid, but of course, way back then it was really bad rock songs and
Sure.
all sorts of things like that. But that helps in a way. It's developing your writing and arranging chops and kind of figuring out things from there. So it helped, but a lot of what I was writing before was just really not good. Let's hope no one ever hears it.
Yeah. Gotcha. So I know you also have another music project called Atlas Deco, if I'm saying that right.
Yep.
How do you describe that music, and what drew you to kind of go in that direction on another project?
So that had always kind of been an interest of mine, writing and producing that kind of music, just because that was another musical genre that I'd always been interested in. I grew up listening to a lot of Deadmau5, in addition to, again, a wide range of artists and genres. But I had always kind of written some tracks like that on the side for what I'm mainly doing, but never really thought of doing anything with it. And then I finally had a few tracks that I thought were pretty good, wanted to release them, wanted to do something with them. So I created this side project called Atlas Deco, and finally started releasing them and working them into the sync world. The best way to describe that sound, it's a little unusual, but I'd go with cinematic house music, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
Because I'm combining synthesizers, stringed instruments, piano, traditional house beats, 4 on the floor, snare on every 2 and 4, but it's just something that I'd always kind of done just on the side for fun. And then recently I've decided, let's actually do something with this instead of just spending the time on these tracks, but then never, ever doing anything with them.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. I'm always curious about this. What is your writing process, if there is one, when you sit down, you're going to write something? Do you have kind of like a go-to method of kind of starting to get your ideas out?
Yeah, that's always a tough question to answer, because it's kind of unknown, and then it's also kind of dependent on what I'm writing for. So if I'm writing for TV production libraries or custom tracks for shows, those always provide very detailed creative briefs, and you really have to strictly adhere to them. So that's more of a kind of a mechanical process in a way, where I know exactly what I'm doing. I follow the same steps every time. And that's done all at the computer, all at the MIDI keyboard, all through sample libraries, just because it has to be done quickly. It has to be done the same every time. But then with artistic work or something that doesn't have to adhere to such a strict style guideline, that I'm always starting at my piano. Because there's something about sitting and playing at an actual piano instead of being in front of a screen at a MIDI keyboard. I don't know how to describe it, but ideas just flow more easily. They develop more easily at an actual piano. So I always start out there, and I usually have no idea what I'm about to play, what I'm about to write when I sit down at the piano. It's very much a reactionary process, where I'll simply just sometimes drop my hands on the keys, hear whatever notes I hit, and then react from that. Okay. I'm never really thinking, okay, I'm playing this as, let's say, the tonic chord, so now let's go to the 5th or anything. I'm very much just playing. okay, let's move my hands over here and see how this sounds. And it's very much reacting to what I'm hearing on the piano and not necessarily thinking about it. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. How much time do you think, I'm sure this is different for everything that you write, but how much time do you think you write or spend writing one piece of music?
That's another one that's entirely dependent on what I'm writing for. So TV production music, sync stuff, a lot of the time I'm working under a really tight deadline. So recently, a lot of work I've been doing has been writing tracks for Crisley Knows Best, which is kind of a reality type TV show. And those I'm literally cranking a track out every 1 to 2 hours.
Oh, wow.
And that's very much because, hey, we need this music right now. We need to review it and get feedback to you immediately, so then you can revise if necessary and then deliver submixes, stems, final masters. So that's obviously the quickest turnaround.
Yeah.
But then my last album release, Figment, was an extremely long process. It took 3 years from writing the first notes to actually releasing the album. And while, of course, not that entire 3 years wasn't spent writing, it certainly was at least a year of writing, months of rearranging, and then recording, re-recording in some cases. So it's all over the place from 1 to 2 hours to years.
Okay.
Sure. It's whatever needs to happen to get the piece to where it needs to be.
Okay. Yeah, that 1 to 2 hours sounds incredibly stressful.
When you do it enough, you start to, develop a rhythm, and it's gotten to the point now I've done enough of these tracks where you don't have to think about it.
Sure.
It writes itself, it arranges itself, it records itself. It's a pretty efficient process now.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I do like having deadlines because for most of what I do, I don't have deadlines. And then my problem is I'll get something 90% there, and then it lives on my hard drive for a while. Maybe I come back to it, maybe I don't. So
I think that's a problem or a issue that everyone faces.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly have too. And that's what I was describing with my Atlas Deco project is I wrote these tracks years ago and nothing ever happened with them until now. So it is tough if you don't have somebody else providing you with a deadline. Setting a hard deadline yourself is tricky sometimes.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk about sync licensing a bit. It's just an interesting world to me that I haven't really dived into myself. And like I've been playing music for a long time. My background mostly is mixing, and so I've been learning kind of composition and producing over the past few years and trying to get myself out of this, like, I'm just learning zone into like, okay, now it's time to like get something out there and like, finish something. And so I'm looking at like this option of sync licensing, and I know a lot of people are doing it, and it can be a great source of income. So what is you have some music on Musicvine. Do you exclusively have all your sync stuff with them, or do you have other libraries that you work with? How does that work?
So yeah, I mean, sync is a great way to generate revenue in music right now, because that's, I mean, with streaming royalties being what they are, and with fewer and fewer people buying music now, it's a lot harder to get your income and revenue from that source. So sync is a great option. And it's one of those things that can continue to earn you revenue year after year on the same piece of music, right? It's great for that. I have a lot of my publicly released music. So the stuff that is released as Philip G. Anderson is available on Musicvine. And that's kind of one of your traditional microsync houses in a way. A lot of their clientele is for YouTube and things like that. And then I have a ton of music that's not publicly released that's with various TV publishers. So like 411 Music Group and Gramoscope Music and Flipper Music, just a bunch of publishers that traditionally and primarily deal with TV programming, maybe larger commercial projects. That's the bulk of my work, and actually the bulk of my income from music is from those sources. But that music is very much the kind of music I was describing earlier, where it's adhering to a style guideline and writing for what they need, not necessarily what I feel like writing or what I want to write. And so it's the music I release as an artist. But those sources generate royalties year after year, quarter after quarter. So when I get my quarterly royalty statement, it's great to see that tracks I was writing 5-6 years ago are still, first of all, appearing in TV shows, and then second, generating royalties for me.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So I hope I answered that question. I'm not entirely sure if I did or not.
Yeah, so with the publishing house kind of side of things, how does that work? Do they approach you and ask you to write for them, or are you pitching music to them? What's that process like?
So it's kind of all over the place, and it's kind of weird how I got into it in the first place. Anyway, when I first started out in music, I was interning out in LA, and then one of my fellow interns, while I was there, after we had both left the place we were working at, started writing this kind of music for TV shows and publishing companies. And he just brought me on one day to help him out writing tracks, because I think he had to write so many he wasn't able to do it. So I got into it that way, and we just started working together on tracks for shows and libraries, and slowly over time we kept writing for more libraries, for more shows, and it just kind of built from there. But then at the same time, I've also just been, in a way, cold approached from publishers that have heard my music in something and say, hey, would you be interested in contributing music to this library? Or, hey, we need this style of music. Can you write an album for us that we can release through our catalog? So it's kind of all over the place how I got into it. But it's all of that is very much I'm writing for what they need. It's not really me pitching to them.
Okay.
I've done that on a couple of occasions, but that's very rare. It's very much, hey, we need an album of this kind of music. Can you get this done? And that's usually how it goes.
Okay. And you were saying that most of your income is produced from that side of the publishing, or just that and plus Sync is kind of your main income?
The bulk of it is definitely from those kind of publishing companies.
Okay.
Sync, with things like MusicVine, does provide a nice bit of income, but it certainly isn't the bulk of it,
okay.
Nor is it enough to solely be the only way to sustain myself.
Okay. Do you have, are you doing music full time, or do you have other things going as well?
No, I am music full time now.
That's
and
awesome.
It is terrifying.
Yeah.
So I graduated 2013, and then up until 2020, I was always working some kind of side job. The last one I had worked was a bartending job. But then, of course, when COVID hit in 2020, I lost that job. So at the time, I was making what I thought or felt like was enough to solely do music. So I said, okay, well, I'm probably not going to get any other kind of part-time job right now. That's just not happening in this pandemic. So let's see if we can finally go full-time music. And almost 2 years later, still surviving. So
that's awesome.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So what other income streams do you have with music then to keep yourself going, aside from Sync licensing, the publishing?
So I do get some royalties from my own publicly released music as Philip G. Anderson, whether that's through Spotify, Apple Music, sales, downloads, or like Content ID on YouTube. Not a lot, but it's enough where if it disappeared, I would be pretty disappointed. And then I do some custom scoring work as well. So right now I'm wrapping up a short film score. And over the past few years, I've worked on a few commercial projects, writing what is essentially a jingle for a commercial project, or I've worked on writing custom music for a video game. So kind of whatever project comes my way that needs custom music, I have been doing that over the past few years, and that's always a decent source of income. And then I also write and now perform for dance and ballet. And I actually have a show in 2 weeks that I'm in the middle of rehearsing for. So I'll be performing that. And that's always a nice little bit of income as well, because you get paid to write, produce, perform the music. And it's one of the best experiences, I think, out of all of the things I do is writing and performing for ballet.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. How did you get into doing that? Did they approach you?
That is very much just personal connection. My wife is a
Okay.
ballet dancer.
Oh, cool.
And we've been together for almost a decade now. So even back when we were in school, she was introducing me to the choreographers she was working with. And then throughout her career, I've always met and networked with people in the dance world. And so over the years, I've been fortunate enough to do projects like that very much through her. I don't know how this would go if I had no personal connection to these worlds. But the performance that's in 2 weeks is through her company. So the choreographer I met with, and we've been working together recently. So we're looking forward to putting that on.
That's cool. Does your wife still dance ballet, or she teach?
She does.
That's
She
cool.
still does it. She recently was the artistic director for a local company, but due to time constraints, had to give that up. But she is still dancing professionally.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My wife was in ballet. I think she started when she was like 3 or something.
Of course. Yeah, that's
That's
kind
how
of
it
when
goes.
you got to start, right?
Yeah. So she did ballet for years and years, and even when we met, and then in college she started teaching, and then she hasn't really done anything since then. But yeah, it's interesting. Going back, you mentioned that short film that you're writing for. How did that come about, and what's the process like with that? Is that just with a like an independent director? How does that work?
So this one I got. I've worked with this director and writer before. This is his own personal project.
Okay.
So working with him again right now, but I'd say about a year and a half, 2 years ago, he brought me on for his first project, and I got introduced to him for that through a mutual friend of ours. He, I guess, mentioned to his friend, "Hey, I'm working on this project. I need music. Do you know anyone?" So he connected me with him. And that's how a lot of my custom scoring work is. It's very much through people I know.
Okay.
So this specific film, it's kind of the same process that all of the films I've worked on. I get an early call going over what the film's about, what they're trying to convey, and then I'll watch a rough cut of it, go over it with the director. These are the points we need to hit. This is the temp music that I like, and this is what I don't like about it, if that needs to be stated too. And then I'll just come up with musical ideas, send them over to them for review, and then just start scoring it scene by scene. And it's constant communication with the director. Hey, what do you think of this scene? What if we try this here? And then it's just going over, reviewing, refining until I hopefully just sent my last revision. So hopefully the music will be finalized come Monday. Cool. And then it's just delivering final files. But it's scoring to pictures is always a fun process, because you're helping tell a story in a way that's not just through the music. And that may not have been the best way to explain that. But when you're releasing your own music, sometimes it's harder to convey what you're trying to say than say through a film, where you have different mediums, whether it's, obviously you're seeing what's happening, you're hearing the dialogue, what's happening, and the music is helping tell the story. So it's a really rewarding and interesting storytelling process.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you ever find yourself like just completely stuck in those situations if you're scoring to picture, and even if they're asking for something kind of specific, do you just get stuck? So, I guess that's a fear of mine. That's why I ask.
No, it's a fear of mine too. It's funny. Every time I start a scoring project, most of the time I sit down and I go, I have no idea how to do this. I don't know what I'm going to write. I don't know if it's going to be any good. But once I sit down and just start playing whatever comes to mind, it always works out. I know that's kind of a weird way to describe that. I haven't run into that situation of hitting a roadblock and not knowing what to do when scoring to custom scoring to picture. However, with some of the TV production music, where let's say I get a style guideline and they need like 50 comedy tracks, I have had problems there, because you write track after track after track, and at some point you're starting to hear the same thing over and over that you're writing. So in those instances, I have had trouble where I'll have to take a step away, because I'm like, this sounds just like the previous track I wrote, or I may have just written myself into a corner and have no way how to write out of this emotional point I hit. So I haven't had that experience in scoring to picture, but I certainly have had that experience in writing tracks and music that will be used in picture.
Sure. Okay. So when you get this project, like a short film, are you pretty much like dedicating all your time to this? Everything else gets pushed to the side until it's done? Or is it, I guess it probably depends like on the deadline, how tight the deadline is, but what's that usually look like when you're on a project like that?
Yeah, I'd love to be able to dedicate all of my time to those kind of projects, but the reality is with the various other projects I'm working on, that's just not possible. So I'm usually working on multiple things at once.
Mm.
So with the short film I'm working on right now, in addition to that, I have had to write tracks for a Christmas episode of a TV show that's coming up. I've also had to finish up tracks for another production album. So it's not entirely in my control. It's kind of whatever's on my schedule I'm working on at the moment. And if the schedule gets to be too much, then you have to say no to projects because you just don't have the time to dedicate to these things. And the film score is certainly what I prefer to spend the most amount of time on because in a way it's the most creative output. But that's just not the reality when I have other projects I have to work on at the same time.
Sure. So I'm trying to remember one of your albums. I can't remember if Figment or something else that you had a couple different players on, string players, I think. So it was a collaboration. What's that like working with? Are you writing the parts? They're recording them, sending them back to you. Are you guys all in the same room when you record that? How's that work for you?
So I imagine you're talking about Figment, my last album, because the players are credited on, like when you open up Spotify.
That's
Phil
probably
G. Henderson and Laura Masoto and Alistar Sung. So all of those projects, I'm just making sure in my head, all of those projects I wrote all the parts for and they recorded. So in a way, I kind of hired them as session musicians.
Okay.
And they're over in Europe, so I wasn't in the room with them, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I would prefer to be because it's always easier. But that just wasn't possible. One, because the expense of traveling, and two, again, that was recorded during COVID. That's not possible to travel over there. But prior to that, previous albums, I had recorded musicians here in the States. It was the same kind of deal. I hired them just for that session, and I had written the music, put it in front of them, they played and performed it. But there are a few pieces. A recent one of mine, Through the Mist, I collaborated with a Dutch cellist, Artie Sun. And that was very much me writing a basic musical idea, sending it to him, and then he wrote something over top of it, and then it went back and forth from there. So that was more of a collaborative approach where they were providing input as well.
Okay.
And they recorded all the parts themselves and sent it to me, and I mixed and mastered it. So it's dependent on the project. I would always prefer to be in the room with the musicians. That's always easier. It's also more rewarding. But sometimes it's not always the reality.
Yeah, totally. That helps. I was going to ask if those collaborations, are they just writing or they're just performing what you're writing versus that other situation where you guys are both actually writing together and collaborating. With those other like kind of session musicians that you hired, are those connections that you already had prior, or did you just find them or word of mouth? How did you get hooked up with them?
On the very first thing I released, my winter EP, those were musicians that I found through my wife again. She was teaching aerobics classes, and one of the people taking the classes was one of the managers at a orchestra in Chicago. So then she mentioned that I was looking for strings players to them, and then they connected me through that. My first full-length album, Wilderness, the strings players on that I was introduced to after I moved here to Georgia. I connected with the local arts association, and then the teachers that were giving strings like violin and cello lessons, they introduced me to, and both of them played on that album. And then the musicians on Figment, Laura Masoto I had worked with before. She's an incredible violinist and artist herself. I had first just reached out to her through email out of the blue, no connection, just saying, hey, I love your music. I love the way you perform. It's incredible. I'd love to work with you at some point. And we had collaborated on a few singles and an EP prior to me bringing her onto my album. And then the cellist who performed on that album, I had heard his work through another artist I know. So I reached out to him, and in a way, kind of a blind email saying, hey, I heard your work on this artist's album, and I loved what you did. I'd love to work with you on mine. So it kind of worked out that way. And from my experience, a lot of musicians are are very open to collaboration and always willing to meet and work with new composers and producers. So sometimes just a cold email is a good way to connect with them.
Yeah, awesome. Kind of switching gears a little bit into recording and producing. You said you record yourself on piano, right? Versus using sample libraries, or at least for piano. How are you miking that, and what's kind of like your process? Do you have like a go-to like chain for your piano specifically?
Yeah, so initially I had been doing piano through sample library because I didn't have my upright piano here where I lived. Prior to living here in Georgia, I was always in a very small apartment that was usually on the top floor of a building or not on the first floor, right? So you can't get a piano in there. It's just not possible. So I either had to book studio time and pay for that, or I could just use some sample library piano. And that got the job done early on. And of course, I still use that for a lot of production music just because for the sake of time and efficiency, that's the better route to go. But now with my artistic work, of course, I'm recording my own piano. And that's downstairs in my living room. So anytime I need to go record that, I kind of got to move part of my rig downstairs and set up there, which is a little bit of a pain, but it's worth it, of course, for the real piano recordings.
Sure, yeah.
I try to keep it simple when recording piano. I'm not a guy that likes a ton of mics, a ton of preamps, a ton of post-production work on it. Just give me a stereo pair right in front of the hammers, and I'm good to go. I usually record my piano with a pair of KSM 137s. They're just two small diaphragm condenser mics.
Okay.
They sound great. They capture everything I need to capture. And then I run it through, I have a Warm Audio WA273. That's probably not the right number. I have a stereo preamp I run them through, and then that just goes straight into the audio interface into the computer. Nothing fancy, but that's how I like it. I'd like to not have to think about the technical aspects of recording when I'm sitting down to perform and record. I want to be focused solely on the performance and not essentially all this other shit that I would have to deal with.
Yeah. Those Warm audio preamps I've heard great things about. I've been looking into those actually. Way more affordable than, the Neve stuff that they're kind of doing. Yeah.
It's kind of a similar thing for me where I wanted to get some solid preamps, and you either have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars, which I just didn't have at the time, or you'd have to get something that just sounded like junk.
Yeah.
And I had seen great reviews for the Warm Audio stuff. So I kind of just said, all right, let's just go with it and see what happens. And I've been really happy with it. It's affordable and it's working really well. They sound good. I don't have any problems with them.
That's cool.
So yeah, I mean, I would recommend checking them out.
Sweet. So when you do use a virtual library, virtual instrument for piano, what do you use?
This is another one that depends on the project. So if I'm doing the TV production music, again, I'm usually following a strict style guideline. So that includes like the type of piano.
Sure.
But I find myself using felted piano sample libraries far more often. So think like the Una Corda library, Spitfire Audio's felt piano through their originals series.
Yeah.
Things like that. They're good piano sounds. They get the job done. They're easy to work with. They don't need a lot of post-production work on them. You don't have to do a ton of mixing.
Yeah.
So I prefer those when working with a sampled piano.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'd love to sample my own piano. I just don't have the time to do that. That'd be the ideal, right? If you could cool sample project, your own piano, yeah.
That'd be
that certainly takes a lot of time.
Sure. Yeah. I know I don't play a ton of piano, and when I do, it's through a virtual instrument of some kind. I do have an upright. That was my grandma's old piano. But it's pretty out of tune, so I don't even bother recording it.
That's how I got my piano. I inherited it from my grandparents, and it had been in storage for almost 2 decades. So I got it, and oh man, that thing was way out of tune. It needed a ton of work, but I thought it was worth hiring someone to come out and give it a proper tuning, make sure everything was working properly. I'm really happy I did. But yeah, if you can get yours sounding good, definitely, it's so worth it.
Yeah, I think it'd be awesome. There are very few times when I'd like that kind of crappy intonation actually kind of sounds cool, But for most of the time, like, I wish this was in tune. One of these days I'll have to do that. How long have you been mixing your own stuff?
Since I started writing, really.
It's part of the learning process.
I've always done the mixing myself. It's probably my weakest skill is mixing and mastering, just because it's what I've spent the least amount of time doing when producing music. So I certainly need to improve on that. But I mix everything myself. I'm starting to master everything myself now. Before, I had always sent it out to a mastering house or a mastering engineer. But I hadn't been too happy with how things were sounding. So I kind of have been trying to learn the mastering process myself and develop those skills on my own so that I can get closer to what I'd like it to sound like. Yeah. The problem with that is, though, once you get to the mastering stage, or at least for me, I've been working on these tracks, on this music for so long, I feel like it needs a fresh set of ears. From writing, recording, mixing. It's just, you hear it so much that it doesn't become stale, but it just needs somebody else to hear what you may not be able to hear because you've heard it so many times now.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are you doing right now for mastering? What's that look like? Do you have a specific process that now you're kind of using for all of your stuff, or are you still kind of moving things around?
So all of my production work, I just have a set mastering chain in my Logic sessions. I use, what is it? I don't remember. I think it's Universal Audio's Abbey Road mastering plugin.
Okay.
I'm blanking on the name. And then I have a couple other plugins I use there, but I have a very set collection of plugins that I use for that I just run things through without having to think much about. Again, that's very much get it done on time, quickly.
Sure.
But then my last album, Figment, I mastered that myself. And that took a while because I had to kind of learn how to master with the plugins I had. And then some of the collaborations I've done with other artists that have been released through labels, they usually like to handle the mastering on their end.
Oh, okay.
So I've had almost no part in the mastering process there, other than, hey, does this sound good to you after it's been mastered?
Yeah. What is when you're mixing strings, what do you tend to pull for plugins on something like that, or how do you process them, or are you even doing much processing to strings?
For recorded strings, I try not to do a whole lot just because it's real easy to overdo it. I like to just get, it's going to sound silly, but just get a good recording the first time and
totally,
you'll be set.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's hard. Sometimes you need to do a little post-production work on them. But again, I'm always very wary to overdo it, just because you can really overboost the highs on strings and then it sounds just really unpleasant to listen to. You can overcompress them really easily and then it's just too much. So I try and keep it simple. With sample libraries, though, usually I do have to do a fair amount of post-production work just to get things to cut through the mix, because oftentimes when I'm using strings in a sample library, it's usually in a track that has a lot of elements and a lot of other instrument groups. So it takes more time and more post-production work to get everything to blend well and everything to be heard clearly.
Yeah. Shoot, that sparked something and now I forgot what it was.
Shoot.
I was just thinking, with like the string, I guess the more that I record, the more I mix, the more I'm like totally convinced that it's all about the source and the performance. Like if you can get those nailed, then like the post-production is like so simple.
I could not agree more.
and just like the more I do it, the more I'm just more convinced of that. And
I think that might be why my mixing chops are so poor, is because I'm so entirely focused on the production part, the recording part, that I try and spend all my time on that rather than the back end. But yeah, oh man, if you can get it sounding right straight through the mic into the preamp and then into the computer, that's it. Yeah. Don't worry about anything after that.
Totally. Yeah. It's like
but that's hard. That's hard to get right. Hard to get sounding good.
And it's kind of a check or a test when I find myself like loading up the plugin chain. I'm like, I must have done something wrong with this. Like I can't get this to fit right or feel right.
I catch myself like that too when I'm working with recorded instruments. If I find myself putting too many plugins on, I go, I did something wrong in the beginning. Totally. I shouldn't need to be doing this.
Totally. Yep. kind of like wrapping up here, what do you have advice for aspiring composers, producers, people who want to do what you do, write for film, for sync, all those things?
So I've been asked this before, and this is always a tough question because I'm to be clear, very much still learning, very much still building my own career. And I'm in no way in a position of power to really say how things should be done. However, from what I've heard over the years is there's no set way to do this, right? There's no like, this is the way you break into music. This is what you have to do to be successful. There's an infinite number of ways to break into the music industry. And there's almost an infinite number of ways to earn a living through music and audio. The one thing I've noticed that, and the one piece of advice I've gotten that I can clearly see being true is just be patient. This isn't a marathon. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. Overnight success isn't something that's going to happen. It's very much slowly build your career over time, build your skills, practice, develop what you need to develop, and the rest will come. More opportunities will open up the longer you stay active in music. You just have to be patient. And I know that's hard, and it's been tough for me too. I'm always thinking, oh, why am I not doing this right now? Why am I not doing this? How come I can't work on this project? And you just have to take a step back and go, look, just give it time. Focus on what you can control. Focus on your skills, getting better, developing your own sound, but just be patient. and the rest will work itself out. Yeah. I think a lot of the time is people have the expectation or may have the expectation that, hey, this should be happening for me in 1 to 2 years or in a short period of time. And then when it doesn't, they may just drop out entirely or give up. But I think if you stay with it, it'll work out.
That's awesome. Dude, thanks so much.
Yeah, sorry. I understand that's kind of a terrifying and in a way an unhelpful piece of advice because there's no way to plan for that, of course. But that's something that I have experienced. The longer I stay with it, the more projects I get. So
no, that's awesome. Well, that's the reality. So
yeah.
It's good to know that's what you're getting yourself into. Man, I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. I think this would be hugely beneficial for me and also for who's listening. So anyone who wants to follow your work, where's the best place to do that? It's just Instagram or website or?
Yeah. So if you want to stay up to date with what I'm working on, you can go to my website, which is www.philipganderson.com. And that's Philip with 1 L. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. And I regularly send out updates and early listens to what I'm working on. You can also follow me on social media. Just search for Philip G. Anderson. I'll come up. Those are the best ways. I'd say the email newsletter, obviously the best way because social media is a pain and a pain to work with these days and not always the most healthy thing to be on.
True.
But you can also find me on there. You can follow me on any of the streaming services like Spotify, Apple Music. So yeah, I'd appreciate it if anyone listening does. And thank you again for inviting me to be on this podcast. I really appreciate it. And it's been great talking with you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you as well. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Philip. Huge shout out and thanks to him for being on the show. Make sure to go follow what he's up to. You can go to his website at philipganderson.com and sign up for his newsletter like he was talking about. And he does updates that way. And you can also follow him on the socials. Before we wrap up for today, make sure to download that free cheat sheet. If you're just getting started, I think that'll be a helpful resource for you. Again, it's my recommendation of the first plugins to purchase as you're getting started and some great, affordable, and even free virtual instruments to use and whatnot. So you can grab that at thestudioarchive.co/cheat sheet. And if you're watching or listening on a platform that allows reviews such as Apple Podcasts, that might be the only one. I don't know which other ones do, but if you can leave a review, go ahead and do so. That would help out a ton on getting this out to other people. And maybe even more importantly, share this podcast with a friend. If you know another producer or composer or even songwriter that this could help out, then make sure to pass it along to them. And maybe this can help more people. That's my hope. So go ahead and do that. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate you. I will catch you in the next episode.